Dear participants, hello and welcome to BBI Lectorium. I'm your host, Sergey Balashov, and the topic of our discussion today is getting self-interested individuals to work for the public good and the right ways to set up the system that honors productive and honest work. So, you are welcome to ask your questions in our chat window during the discussion. Just collapse the live stream window and push the chat button in the bottom right corner. If the sound or the video gets frozen at any moment, just renew the page and then push the play button. Please don't forget to not just renew the page, but also to push the play button. And now let me introduce to you our guest for today. We are joined by Nicholas Gruen, who's a prominent Australian economist and commentator on economic reform and social innovation. He describes himself as an economist using economics as an engine of inquiry and not a set of ready-made prescriptions. In year 2000, he founded economic consultancy Lateral Economics, and advised federal and state governments as a consultant and as a member or chair of various government-appointed committees. He is also the chairman of the Open Knowledge Foundation in Australia and a visiting professor at King's College London's Public Policy Institute. Also, he was formerly chair of the Australian Centre for Social Innovation and Kaggle, a Google subsidiary that organizes the world's largest data analytics competitions. Nicholas, happy to have you join us today.
Hi, Sergey.
So I would like to start our conversation today with just prehistory of how I came across your work. We've been having a lot of business consultants on this series, people who advise business leaders on how to align members of large organizations towards working for the good of the company and achieving the mission that the company has set. And I came across the idea that actually you can largely compare governments and societies to large corporations, and you've been working in the field of public policy and thinking about how we can create systems that encourage people to practice their professions to the public good while they're obviously following their personal motivations and personal interests. Now, I've introduced you as an economist and an expert on public policy. Could we talk about what's been the connection between these two disciplines throughout your career?
So, I mean, my background is quite an interesting introduction to the way I think about these things, because I started getting involved in professional work on public policy when I worked for Australia's industry minister, who was called Senator John Button, and this is in the mid-80s. And so the industry minister, one of the things that I was working on was our car industry, coming up with good policies to try and make sure not just that the car industry was prosperous, because that's easy. You can just give money to an industry and it'll become prosperous. The idea is to make the industry an industry which will make money for the country, not just for itself. And so when I got there, I had never studied economics, and I spent a lot of my time talking to economists, and there were And at the time then, and this is still the case, economists constituted a kind of faction of policymakers. And in Australia at the time, the big thing for economists was that they were free traders. They didn't believe in having tariffs on imports or any other obstacles and so on. And of course, the industry loved the idea of having obstacles to imports and all the rest of it. Now, what then happened was that I was sympathetic with the economist's position, but there was more to the problem. There were a bunch of things that the economists weren't looking at. And the part of the story that I haven't told you is that although I'd never studied economics at that point, I sort of had, because my father is an economist, or was an economist, and I took this, I used to have lots of discussions with him over the breakfast table and so on. So I really did understand the way economic thinking worked. I just hadn't gone and learnt all the equations and all that sort of stuff. And to this day, I think of the equations and the technical things inside economics as a long way down the food chain, not a terribly, you obviously don't want to get them wrong if they're relevant, but very often these things that we learn at universities become badges of pride, badges that we're the best, and we forget that these disciplines we learn really are vehicles for helping us to think. And that's how I started having some debates with economists at the time. I don't know whether it's a particularly good use of our time to go into those, because we'll get to illustrations of the way I think that are more interesting later on. But very early on, I started to do economics in this way, and I eventually called my consulting company Lateral Economics, which is suggesting something similar. And in the last 5 or so years, I've sometimes given on a couple of occasions a talk which is called Lateral Economics, a Brand or a Method. And in a sense, I think of myself, I can't think of anyone quite like the way doing economics quite like I do. And it's really a method. It's just using ideas, very simple ideas in economics. That's their great strength. That's their great weakness. You can blow up the world with simple ideas if they're wrong or wrongly applied. But they're very powerful. And but the art is in finding the right ways and imaginative ways to apply them, rather than sort of say, stand aside, the economists have arrived and we've got all the answers.
Perfect. If we look at at economics as a set of tools to solve society's problems, let's say, what are some of those tools, and how is that different from thinking that economics is a ready-made ideology that, like, the market should sort everything?
So, I mean, a big thing for me has been. I'll give you an example from the. I'll give you an example from the story I was telling you. So I told you that the economists were all in favor of free trade and the industry wanted to keep their tariffs. So it's quite obvious that you should, unless you've got good reason, you shouldn't put obstacles in the way of trade. So I was a free trader. But the point was that we weren't going to get to free trade for a decade or more. And so the next question is, well, if we will have a lot of assistance for a long time, and there are good ways of providing that assistance and bad ways of providing that assistance. The economists didn't really want to talk about that, and they had a formula for reducing assistance, and the formula went like this. Take existing trade barriers, which will be subsidies and tariffs, turn them all into tariffs and then gradually lower them. Now, there's a problem with that, and the problem is this, that leaves exports completely unassisted. So you have very highly assisted production for the domestic market because it's assisted by the high prices in the domestic market because of tariffs. And if the industry is going to survive at free trade, you're going to want to develop an export market. You want it to go into exports. So the economists just didn't really want to talk about this. They said, oh, well, if we have exports, then we'll just have more assistance. If you have assistance to exports, you'll just have more assistance. And I'm saying, no, this assistance regime is going to be there for a decade. So we have to look this problem in the eye, look this issue in the eye and say, how can we possibly justify assembling Toyota Corollas that are mostly made in Nagoya in Japan, in Australia, at very high levels of assistance, while our own indigenous cars are not given any assistance at all. So then I translated it into economics and I said, you guys are focusing on inter-industry barriers. So you're saying Australia's coal industry, Australia's wool industry, and Australia's car industry should all be assisted in the same way. That's what getting to free trade would do. No problem with that. Now look at the car industry. In other words, our export industries and our import replacement industry, our industry supplying the domestic market, should get the same amount of assistance. I don't have a problem with that. But the point is, for the next 10 years, that won't be the case inside the car industry. So not only do you have an argument in favour of a level playing field between exports and supplying the domestic market between industries, you also have that argument within every industry. And so by translating the problem I could see into this economic language, you then give yourself the resources of the discipline, the resources of thinking about this. So that's a rather long-winded example of that sort of thing. Another idea in economics is competitive neutrality. So I ask the question, with a central bank, so I don't know what yours is called in Russia, in America it's the Fed. Yeah, in America
it's literally called the central bank. Yeah.
Okay, and in America you've got the Central Reserve, you've got the Fed. In Europe you've got the ECB, the European Central Bank. In Australia you've got the Reserve Bank of Australia. Though the central bank provides banking services to commercial banks. So in England, the Bank of England provides banking services to Barclays, and the Fed provides banking services to Chase Manhattan. One of the questions I've asked is, if our commercial banks can bank with the central bank, why can't I? Now, that was a silly question to ask in the 19th century or right through until the development of the internet, because it's not necessarily a sensible thing to start central bank branches all around the country to do retailing. But that's not the case anymore. So I was arguing this sort of 10 years ago. That's another example where this basic idea of a level playing field takes you to some very productive questions. Another basic question, which I think we might get on to talk about more, is that that our economy is made of public goods, which are things like, cars and cookies and anything you buy in a shop. And if I said public goods, I meant private goods. Private goods. I'm sorry, yes. And then there are public goods, and public goods would be suburban roads, the military, things that you can't buy in the market. So you have to come up with another way of supplying them. And that's a tremendously important thing. And there are a whole bunch of new ways you can think about that. And I think of that as an incredibly fundamental thing, not just about economics, but about pretty much everything. So you and I are each on a different continent. We each have different interests, different needs. We are sharing something, which is we're having a conversation. So that is each of us are getting something private out of it. Each of us are constructing something shared with it, and we're using a public good. You won't read about this public good in an economics textbook, but you will if you read enough economics textbooks. It's not as if I'm saying something that economists won't agree with, but the language that we're using is a public good, but it's not produced by the government. It's not produced by the government. We produce it privately, unless you're in France when they have police out there making sure you use it in the right way. But most countries don't have that sort of problem.
We might have that anyway.
You might, yes. You might. So I always this is a way that I've now got of thinking about these things, and it leads me. Firstly, it sort of enriches things a lot, and it leads me to quite powerful policy insights and just insights into our world. So those are some examples of how you take these very simple ideas, and when you start thinking in those terms, you kind of see them everywhere, and they give you magic goggles, or maybe they just make you a mad scientist. Who knows?
Perfect. So now that you've mentioned one of the core terms that we're going to be discussing today, the distinction between public and private goods, let's go to your essay that you've sent me, and that will provide a link to in a newsletter after this broadcast, which is called The Competition Delusion. Can you please introduce the notion of competition delusion to the audience, and talk a little bit about how the phenomenon behind it becomes a source of problems in society and organizations sometimes?
Yeah. So it's not, I'm sure, I hope I'm not telling your audience anything new when I say that competition is something that there's a lot of ideological combat over. So if you're more to the right, you're going to think that competition's a good thing. And if you're more to the left, you're going to argue that we should have more cooperation in society and more caring and all that sort of stuff. That's a debate that is an important debate. I guess we wouldn't be having so much of it if it wasn't an important debate. You have to hope so. But there's something even more fundamental, and I don't think we're using the right language to talk about it. Or if we are, this is another language that I would like to introduce, which I think gives us some really big insights. And let me start with, earlier on tonight, I watched my football team. They won, I'm very pleased to say. I think Australia's national game is quite famous around the world. It certainly is in the United Kingdom and the United States. It's called Australian Rules Football, and I recommend it to people. It's very spectacular. Anyway, let me ask you, Sergey, were the players competing or cooperating?
Now that you ask, I think normally players in a football team are supposed to cooperate towards the common goal of winning the match, right?
Yeah.
But now that you've asked me this question, and since we are talking about this economic lens, I have this example coming back to me from a book called Freakonomics, written by Stephen Levitt, where he analyzed the fact that when they have a penalty session, right, and it's just an empty field, and the I'm not sure about the soccer terminology because I don't play it much, but like the attacking person is just a clear field and a goalkeeper. And
that's right. It's called a penalty. It's called a penalty. I think it's called an 11-yard penalty or 11-meter penalty.
And the goalkeeper, because of the time constraint, he only can sort of guess where the ball is going to fly.
Correct.
Right?
That's right.
That's right. I don't remember the particular details, but when they did a statistical analysis of what's the best chance for the attacker to score a goal,
stay in the middle.
It turned out that it was just stay in the middle.
Yeah.
So from the point of view of a team and of collaboration, they should always shoot for the middle. Well, like if that statistic still holds. They very rarely do that, because this is apparently a place where personal incentives kick in, and it has nothing to do with collaboration. And the incentive is if you score into the middle, but you don't score because the ball gets caught, you look like an idiot.
You look like a dill. That's right.
Yeah, you look like people gonna hate you. If you make a spectacular stroke and the ball flies like toward the corner of the
impossible to stop.
goalpost,
That's right.
that you miss, at least you look like you've had a good chance. So this is an interesting moment at which players stop cooperating, even though they normally should do. Anyway, but getting back to your argument.
So that's not okay. So that's quite a good example. I'd call that an example of the non-alignment of incentives. So let me unpack the game, and I'd say firstly, it's pretty obvious that the players, the players in the team are cooperating with each other, and they're cooperating in order to compete. Now, that's not going to surprise anyone, but there's a sense in which both of the teams are cooperating too. How are they cooperating? Because they both share the same rules. And that might sound like a trivial thing to you, but the entire competition is a creature of this form of cooperation, which is we're all going to meet on a field, we're all going to agree on the rules, we're even going to go so far as to agree on an umpire so that if we ever debate each other about the rules, we've got a proper objective answer, and so on. So that's a big deal for me. The more I've thought about it, the more I've seen that our economy and our society is that sport is in fact about the most perfect alignment of these incentives between cooperation and competition, because we've already worked out that we don't want the two sides competing about what the rules are. We've worked out that we want the two sides competing within the rules, not about the rules. But compare
Can
that.
I ask a question at this point, just to make sure we get it? Yeah. So you've mentioned the that the two teams competing to win the game, they also have a deeper level at which they actually both teams cooperate. And my question is, do I understand it correctly that when you talk about this, it's like basically you mean that the two teams fighting each other in a match are cooperating in the sense that the framework of the rules allows them to have the game that we all enjoy.
Absolutely. That's the point. And let's say, Sergey, that you and I disagree about something, and then we get a bit heated about it, and then we start yelling at each other. Well, we're cooperating throughout because we're speaking English, and what's happening, and what would be bad, and what often happens, is that I say to you, oh well, you would say that, wouldn't you, Sergey? You're really pissing me off, or whatever, or I start interrupting you. And then I say, or you're interrupting me, and I say, can I get a word in edgeways? Okay. So what's happening there is very different to what's happening on the field in a professional game, because what's happening there is we're having the game, if you like, which is the conversation, and we're kind of maneuvering around what the rules of the game are. Yeah. And that is, and the idea that competition is always good. And this comes up in economics, for instance, in a university seminar, when economists and various other academic academic fields are very proud of how combative seminars are. Now, I'm not somebody who wants to be super if I think somebody's wrong, they'll probably pick that up. But in fact, if I do it in a nice way, then I'm more likely to they're more likely to listen to me. I'm more likely to listen to them rather than start rolling my eyes and going, oh, well, you're just so right wing, or you're so left wing, and you would think that, and all that kind of stuff. And so what we are in so many parts of our lives is that we have these private interests, but we're both of us in social interactions, we're also in charge of the rules. And and we can start sort of skirmishing about those rules. And the competition delusion is the idea that competition is good throughout this process. And I say competition is good in a sport. There are small things that are not very interesting about whether you should cheat against the rules. But, the thing about professional sport is that you don't get very far if you're not really, really good at playing the sport. That's kind of the basics. And in every other avenue of life, there's a lot more luck, and there's a lot more room for strategic behavior. And that's in the nature of things. We're never going to get it all perfect, but we should be talking about those things when we talk about economic policy, when we talk about our culture, when we talk about our politics, because that's of the essence. How are we making the rule? How are these rules of the game negotiated as we play the game? And there are all kinds of things in our economy. So let me give you an example from legal procedure. In English-speaking countries under what's called the common law system or adversarial legal systems, and I'm not sure what system you have in Russia, but that's in comparison with the German system, which is called an inquisitorial system. And the difference is that in the adversarial system, the judge's role is seen to be relatively passive and is essentially there to arbitrate. It's essentially there to arbitrate between the two sides. And the idea is that the winner of the case is the winner, that you'll get the right answer by letting the defense and the prosecution argue their little heads off, take the case wherever they want to, and whoever wins, that's the truth. So if you look at expert evidence in an English-speaking court of law, you'll have experts for the prosecution. Let's say the question is, does ballistics expertise prove that this gun that fired that bullet that killed that person? Then one side will pick one ballistics person, the other side will pick another ballistics person. Is this sounding like a good way to promote expertise to you? Because what it does is that each side goes on a shopping spree to try and get an expert that's going to say as close as possible to what they want. They're remunerating those experts. So I think probably using ballistics wasn't a good idea of mine. I should use psychiatrists, for instance. So there are going to be psychiatrists with very different views about whether someone's got a particular condition and so on. And so if you have an insurance case and someone's trying to exercise some right under an insurance contract, and they have to prove that they weren't mad at some point, or that they have they have depression or something like that, then what's going to happen is that this system is going to effectively breed lawyers who say that, no, that's not depression, that's just normal, and lawyers who say, no, that's definitely depression. And they're all getting paid well for interpreting their expertise in a way that is favorable to their paymasters. Well, is there a worse way? Is there a more disrespectful way to treat expertise than that? It's a complete joke. And in a German court, that's not how it's done. In a German court, which doesn't suffer from the competition delusion, they understand that most of these decisions shouldn't be made competitively. What we want is as good expertise as we can get. And so the court goes and appoints the expert to help the court find the truth. So that's
so the expert doesn't have an interest in defending one side or the other.
Correct. And so what we're saying there is that the expertise itself is a public good. It should be shared between the parties in the same way that the rules of a game are shared between the parties. And the moment we see competition, the moment we see competition leaking into a public good, you're going to degrade that public good. And we can see that in our economy, and we can see that in our public life. And I can go on and elaborate if you'd like me to.
Yeah, I would like to suggest a metaphor to bring this into a corporate world a little bit.
Yeah.
So let's imagine there's a large corporation. Some of our audience would come from like companies that have like several thousand employees, and there would be departments. And there's a budget, right? And let's say you have different departments competing for the budget, right? Because this exactly. means resources. This means the ability to create some financial incentives for the employees while they're working on a project. And like there's a company and they have mission X, and there are like two departments that are competing for a particular piece of the budget, and they have their respective heads who might defend their particular projects
exactly
in front of whoever's doing the financial planning. Now, this very much looks like, the interests of a particular department and in terms of financing would be like a private good sort of, but the decision that would benefit the company and the rules that govern how you decide is sort of the public good for that particular company, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's an application of the that's an application of the idea. And then you go into this question, well, how do we get people in the company putting the company's interests first rather than their own team's interest first? And that's a hard question, because in the public service, for instance, I mean, my way of relating to the world, I certainly don't like being bossed around, but I don't like bossing people around either. And large organizations are full of people who like to boss people around. And in the public service, there are endless departments and they're all competing for money. Now, if I was a head of a public agency, what I would like to do is I would like to just go into a budget round and say, these are the things we can do with this money. These are the things we could do with other money, but you guys need to make the decision and you just tell us what money you're going to do it and we'll do the best we can. But that would be naive, because all of the other units are acculturated they're all used to bidding. And so if I want this function that I represent to be on a level playing field, if you like, then I end up playing the game as well. And nothing could illustrate better the competition delusion, or if you think that's a good thing. And also the fact that the culture of the company is a public good. And it's hard you can say, oh, well, I just want everyone to tell the truth around here, but they all have to start doing it at once. Otherwise, things don't work out very well, because the ones who are good at playing the games, they all get more money, and the result is even worse. So you end up, so what happens is that within cultures, you can have sort of high roads and low roads. High road would be everyone is really thinking about the company. And then the low road is you get a result which isn't nearly as good, but it's still balanced because everyone's lobbying and trying to get their own funding. And then something probably worse than that is, an organization where, marketing and audit do one thing, and sales and operations, this much more laissez-faire approach, and they don't go lobbying for their bit of the pie, and then you have a kind of distorted set of representations about what's most important within the company. So that's an illustration of it. But another illustration of it, and this is, I think, really around the whole world, is that auditors are now the idea of an auditor is to generate a public good. What's the public good that an auditor generates? Well, the auditor puts a stamp on the accounts and says these financial accounts represent reality. But what do we do with audit? We get the company to appoint the auditor. And that's all in the name of competition. And that's the competition delusion. We really should have a process for picking auditors, which is not, the auditors are holding companies to account, then they can't be appointed by those companies. And let's go further than that and say, and look at what happens here, because it isn't just that it makes corporate collapses and so on more likely. It is that suddenly what becomes really lucrative in audit isn't this process of ensuring that company accounts represent reality. You have to do that because you have to meet your accounting standards, the auditing standards. But where the real money gets made is people who can be clever about meeting the letter of the auditing standards, but not their spirit, and enabling a company to expense something that really is not good practice to expense and essentially misleads the market and so on. So that's a classic example where we think we're so clever that audit is competitive. And of course, and you do want, it's fine to have auditing companies competing with each other, but not competing with each other to do the dirty work of the companies that hire them.
Mm-hmm. How can that be changed, though, on the level of, let's say, legislation, maybe, or somehow?
Oh, you can. There are lots of ways you can do it. You can have a board that, an independent board that appoints auditors. They're paid the same kind of an amount, and they do the job. And you can have various kinds of ratings. You can. It's not that you want to do away with the idea of quality. So you can have them rated in various ways. You can have them rated by companies that are audited by them. But since the companies aren't paying them or choosing them, then the companies are paying them because there will be some levy that they pay, and then they get an auditor. But you're not trying to get rid of the idea of good auditors and bad auditors, but you are saying that whoever selects the auditor, there shouldn't be a conflict of interest in choosing the auditor.
Okay. At this point, I would like to go back to the moment where we were discussing football as a cooperation. I think it's a very clear metaphor. And when I mentioned the
football, sorry, I don't know what football as a corporation is. Football.
Football.
Yes,
sorry.
got you. Yeah.
Exactly. And so we were talking about the team cooperation and how players are supposed to be cooperative in order to win the game. And then I've described this example, which was brought up by another economist, of the forward person trying to score a goal during a penalty. So you, in your essay, you also talk about the distinction not just between private goods, which where competition is appropriate, and public goods, which are sort of like the framework that regulates the process, but also about internal and external goods being like sort of two different kinds of rewards for an activity. So talking about football, it looks to me like enjoying a great game, which you then honestly win, is sort of an internal good for the player, for the audience as well, but mainly for the players. But then supposing if that person doesn't score a goal during a penalty, but he looks spectacular he gets the
Yeah.
media attention. He might get
That's right.
Loved by the fans, and maybe he's somehow, even though he didn't score and the team didn't win because he didn't choose to score in the middle, let's say, maybe he gets a better contract, or like somehow his financial rewards go up because he didn't look stupid. So like all these financial and prestige rewards are sort of like the external goods of a practice. And in these terms, we can talk about the conflict between them. Like according to the like internal goods motivation of having a great game that you honestly play and then win, he could have chosen to shoot for the middle, but he shoots for the corner because it's more fashionable, and in terms of external goods, that's better. It looks to me that that sort of a situation is a perfect metaphor for what happens a lot in corporations when leaders are competing for power within an organization. What are some of the ways you could think of that could help align the conflict, like get rid of the conflict between internal goods for the company that would be achieving its mission, and external goods, just personal financial rewards, prestige, and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah,
because
well, let me so let me sort of set up this idea of internal and external goods a bit more. These were first proposed by a philosopher I'm a fan of called Alistair McIntyre, and he uses it. He uses to explain the difference. He talks about teaching a child chess, and he says that the internal goods of chess, these are what internal goods are, is they're not directly moralistic. They're not doing the right thing. They're a practice that is a game, or a practice like being a lawyer or an auditor or a scientist or an artist. There are he says there are goods of these practice, and the goods are internal goods. And so the internal goods of chess are analytical ability, strategic insight, competitive intensity. These are the things that will help you win a chess game, and they're human qualities of excellence. And then the external goods are extrinsic rewards, external rewards. And in the game of chess, the girl gets to enjoy winning, and in fact he uses the example of giving the girl candy if she wins. And what that does now, the candy and the extrinsic rewards are called extrinsic because they've really got nothing to do with chess at all. And one of the things that he's talking about is, he says that orders, any practice like accounting or anything else, requires external incentives like money. For instance, you want to pay people, unless you just want people doing it as a hobby, you have to pay people. But once you pay people, these extrinsic rewards can often be in tension with the internal good. The extrinsic goods, the external goods, exist in some tension and actually subvert the internal goods. And I think this is a very powerful point. And if you think about being a lawyer or an expert, let's say you're an expert, the sort of expert who is brought before a court to give your expertise in psychiatry, would you rather do that in Germany or in an English-speaking country? Because in an English-speaking country, you're going to end up feeling dirty. You're going to end up feeling, and if you give evidence which is entirely sincere, you'll still feel used by the other side, by the side who hired you, because they don't care about the truth. They're trying to win a case. Whereas if you're in Germany, the extrinsic rewards, because you get paid for this, the extrinsic rewards line up much more closely with the internal goods. And so there's much less of attention. And so the whole culture of expertise is more likely to be a support, one that supports the internal goods rather than just uses them as means to an end. And again, this allows me to go back to this, what I was talking about, the competition delusion, because it's the same kind of thing. In fact, I don't know whether I can find it in time, but basically, McIntyre, this philosopher, says that in a society that is overwhelmed with competition, you actually end up without internal goods. You just get people jockeying and appearing as best they can to have these internal goods. And when you really need them, you need to kind of hire them. But no one really cares about them. They all care about winning. And think about that and think about how modern politics works. Because modern politics, if you think about a candidates debate, two candidates for president debating on the TV, I'm old enough to remember candidates debate. They were never pretty, but 30, 40 years ago, they were about policy. And today, they're not about policy at all. They're about body language. They're about how you do research into what sort of phrases you ought to use and so on. So what you're getting is the actual content that what life should be about, what this politics should be about, is these internal goods of politics. How do we get good police force? How do we get a functioning school system, a good health system? And those things are more and more side effects, what the politicians care about. And those who don't care about them are forced to care about them because they'll lose if they don't care about them, is going over well on the TV, combing their hair more than I have done tonight, for instance, and being very fluent in the way in which they put things, which ideally is a fine thing. But it's an ornament to what should be the substance. And so this is a really big deal. I'll give you one other very economic example, which is forecasting, economic forecasting. How are we going for time? We've still got about 10 more minutes. Yeah. So economic forecasting, when people forecast, in economics, they use a point forecast. So they predict something and they don't give a confidence interval. They don't say there's an 80% chance that growth will be between 1.5% and 3.5%. They say, oh, my forecast is 2.75% growth next year. That's a completely useless forecast because it won't be 2.75%. It'll be 2.8% or 2.6%. And even if it was 2.75%, that just means you're dead lucky. And so the amount of information in the forecast is extremely low. And that means that economists are extremely bad at forecasting and they don't have any incentives to get better. And as a result, they don't pick. You can ask whether their discipline should allow them to do better than they do, because after all, you're trying to predict the future, and that's not an easy thing. But what I can tell you is that the incentives don't exist for them to understand their own ignorance, to be honest about that with themselves and with the people that they're reporting to. And as a result, it's well known that economists and people who work in economics, like finance directors of companies, are hopelessly overconfident. If you ask them, for instance, give me a range of 80% within which the stock index will be in 3 months or a year, they'll give you a range, and they're completely wrong about it. They'll give you the range will be true maybe 20% of the time or something like that. So they're showing immense overconfidence. And most professions, Daniel Kahneman, the behavioral economics guy, says that all professions are overconfident because we train people with skills and they go out and they overestimate the value of those skills. That's, if you'll pardon my expression, that's bullshit. I can give you two disciplines that are not overconfident. One is engineers who are building bridges, and the prediction you want to know is, what are the chances of this thing falling down? And they have worked very hard to be able to give you a very good number on that, of a very precise answer to that question. So if you focus expertise not on pretending, not on showing these experts that you're training how setting them up to prove how clever they are to everyone else, but actually giving them insight into their own level of knowledge and ignorance, and they have to learn it and test it and so on, they actually don't become overconfident, because the skill, it's understood, the skill, or the internal good, if you like, is the skill of being transparent about their level of knowledge and their level of ignorance. That's one profession. The other profession that is notoriously not overconfident, you know what that is? Weather forecasters. Weather
really?
forecasters.
Okay.
And the reason is that how do weather forecasters make their prediction? What do they say about the chance of rain tomorrow?
I'm not sure. Like the app that I use is just says it's going to be that.
Okay, well, they say it's a 60% chance of rain, and that means we can hold them to account. All we have to do is we have to go back 100 days, look at all the days, that they said there was a 60% chance of rain the next day, and find out what proportion of those had rain the next day. And we know whether they're accurate or not in telling us how much they know and how much they don't know. In other words, every forecast is a forecast of their own ignorance, is a forecast of what they don't know. To say that there's a 60, they're saying there's a 60, another way of putting that is, I think it's going to rain and there's a 60% chance I'm right. That's not what an economist says. An economist says, my forecast is 2.5% growth. Now, the economist's environment is an environment where there's no incentive to get better, because no one can tell a good forecaster from a bad forecaster. And the incentive, and so there's no incentive, and so the external goods don't reinforce the internal goods. And in these other professions that I described, they do.
I have a follow-up question to that, since you've mentioned Daniel Kahneman. And so what I believe he was kind of talking about is that he has this interesting passage in the book Thinking Fast and Slow, where, or like I believe one of his talks, where he basically says that we sort of we have a culture also, like particularly in corporations, right? Since we are talking about, like, let's say financial forecasts, they're usually done in order to proceed with one line of action or another line of action for a business, right? And he talks about how detrimental to corporations is the fact that we retrospectively reward the decisions that have turned out to be right, even instead of another option that he suggests, that there should be a culture that rewards being able to provide a solid argument for your prediction that is understood by other people, regardless of whether that turns out to have been a good decision or not retrospectively. So he says a good decision as a carefully considered and informed one, even if later on in retrospect, it turns out to have led to a financial loss, for example. Whereas decisions that by sheer luck have ended up being good, but were based on an unsolid reasoning, shouldn't be considered as good decisions. And so in this context, would it be correct to say that the culture of providing a careful, a considered reasoning for your actions can be considered sort of like an internal good in the discipline of making decisions?
Absolutely, no question about it. And that's there's no question about that. And I would say that organizations generally are not very good at this, and that goes for private organizations as well. I mean, another thing that Kahneman talks about is, and it's, I mean, Warren Buffett talks about it. There's a very deep pathology in organizations for the people lower down to sniff out what they think the people above think. And so, for instance, there will be, you know, the senior manager, some senior figure will have a gut feeling that a particular project is a good project, and he'll go away and get a business case done about it. And it's not very rigorously done, even if it's done by very brilliant accountants and all the rest of it, because it's not very hard to, you've got to make all kinds of assumptions. There are lots of degrees of freedom. And so what happens is that the organization, the people lower down in the organization, try to, even subconsciously, provide analysis which is going to make sense to people further up. And so there are just lots of these things, lots of these pathologies. I personally think that groupthink is the great enemy in an organization. I know that Kahneman has a similar view, and quite a lot of his stuff. There's a lot of management writing which is really the sort of senior manager as hero. You know, you like In Search of, some people will have heard of the book In Search of Excellence, and the basic idea behind In Search of Excellence was to find the companies in the top quartile of corporate performance over the financial corporate performance over the previous 5 years, I think it was, and then ask them what their secret was. Well, there's no harm in, they'll tell you their secret was forward planning and tough decisions and rigorous this and rigorous that. There's no way to every company in the Fortune 500 is going to have a story to tell you about that. So there was no rigor in this process. And then along came some analysts after the book was published and looked at the performance of these companies that Tom Peters had told us were the definition of excellence in the next 5 years, and the average was in the bottom quartile. So what was happening was you were looking at pure randomness, but with what Nassim Taleb calls the narrative fallacy. We can make up a story for any of this stuff. This is the opposite of thinking, and there's a lot of it that goes on in corporations. We're probably towards the end of our talk. If you want to do another hour on that, I'd be very happy to talk to you about it.
I think if we can go sort of like several minutes over that would be okay for us.
Sure.
If it's
no
okay
problem.
for you, I would like to bring
absolutely.
up this final question that is actually not just a question, but a title of another one of your essays, which we'll also send a link to our audience via the follow-up newsletter. And the question is, leadership without careerism, is it possible? So is it? And what exactly is
okay.
that?
So let me set the scene by saying my personal view of the world is that we have a kind of sovereignty-dominated view of the world. What does that mean? What I mean by that is that there's a sort of big boss at the top, and decisions get made, and then they radiate down from the top. Now, that's also true of democracy. So democracy is a sovereign system where there will be some process of validating or legitimating the decision made at the top. That is, we all voted on whether or not to invade Iraq, and then now we've made a decision, we're invading Iraq. And so the way you're thinking about the world is that there's something at the top, and then it filters down, then decisions filter down from the top. That's true. And then if you look at the way our economy works, a private market isn't like that in the sense that firms compete with each other, but within the firm, you've got the same story, which is there's a single owner typically, and I mean there can be lots of owners, but it's a unitary ownership structure, and therefore it has policies, they're singular policies and so on, and that almost invariably produces tremendous lack of healthy diversity within the organization. And it also does something else, which is that it more and more we reward a certain kind of person, and that's the sort of person who puts themselves forward indeed, we began this conversation talking about competition and cooperation, people who are competitive, people who are self-assertive. And if you keep giving greater and greater rewards to the self-assertive, the healers, the thinkers, the people who are trying to connect things up feel like more and more like mugs, while the not particularly brilliant but highly competitive, highly strategic players get more and more power and more money. And I think that's infecting our democracy as we have a certain type of person who becomes successful in politics and so on. So I am a supporter of introducing into our democracies, which are based on elections, mechanisms which are like juries, where you simply randomly, so you have one group of people who represent the people because they've voted for them. That's all democracies in the world operate like that. But our legal system has a thing, the jury, where the public are represented not because anyone's voted for someone, but because you've gone and selected a representative sample of ordinary people, and then you've said, we want you to come up with a consensus, and then we'll say that consensus is a consensus which has been legitimated by the people. That's another way to do democracy. In South Australia, a few years ago, there was a very big citizen jury. So that involves taking this jury-like mechanism, which is to just get ordinary people and then get them to think about an issue. And there were 340 people, and they were talking about nuclear power and a bunch of some controversial things. And the people who were organizing it were people like me who were quite suspicious of elections and the way in which they turn everything into a competition. So they said, but they needed spokespeople, because if you have 340 people who come to a conclusion, a strong majority conclusion, then the media is going to want to interview them and so on. So they said, we've got to select spokespeople. And so the people who organised it didn't want to have an election for reasons that will be obvious given the story that I've told you. So they did something which I thought was just fabulous. They said, all right, who wants to be a spokesperson? This is a 4-day process. This is, I think, on the afternoon of the 4th day. They said, who wants to be a spokesperson? About 15 people stood up. And then they said, okay, now point to the third person on your right. You can now sit down. And the person 3 to your right, please stand up. Then they said to them, we will take this group and we're going to spend an hour deciding what the criteria should be according to which we select spokespeople. And then they're going to talk among themselves about who they've met over the last 3.5 days who meet those criteria. We're going to come out and we'll ask you if you're happy. And we're coming up with 10 people or however many people who will be spokespeople. They went through this process, was incredibly successful. It even had gender balance, even though one of the criteria was not gender balance. And that, of course, is the best possible way to get gender balance. And everyone was very happy about it. Now, what strikes me about it is that it's a method of identifying merit that is not dependent on self-assertion. Now, I don't know what the role of this might be, but I think these kinds of mechanisms could be extremely powerful and certainly should be thought about in all kinds of different organizations. And I'm not saying that they should replace normal processes. They should supplement them. We should experiment with them, because what they can do is they can start the process where people who we all recognize as really team players, as the people who really want to do the right thing, aren't disadvantaged against all the strategic and most competitive and most articulate players who are best at putting on, are best at competing for people's votes. I'll just say in conclusion that Malcolm Gladwell has just had a look at this. His most recent podcast, or perhaps less one, so a week ago, was in his podcast called Revisionist History, looks at some activity, I think, in Bolivia, where school student councils, school captains and so on, are chosen via this sort of mechanism, which is just they choose people who want to do a job, and then they and then they choose at random those from a whole lot of people who've said they'd be interested in the job. They don't have an election, and it's a very interesting podcast, and it's really about this same thing, and the way that so many of our cultures, so many of our organizations are just saturated in self-assertion. Self-assertion is good, but so are lots of other things.
Wow. I would like to follow that quickly up with just sort of a question to make sure I've understood the difference. So basically, you're saying that would be people who are, like, by their nature of how they do things, these sort of careerist leaders, sort of like narcissistic, self-assertive,
well, that's the bad side. They're not all narcissists, but certainly they're overweight narcissism. You know, that we get far too many narcissists at the top. That's absolutely true. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they have a proclivity for this, putting on a show that gets recognized, and like they win by charisma. Now, there is a certain other type of leaders who are just competent and suited for the job, etc. They might not meet in an environment which is like, let's say, a voting procedure, like primaries in the US or whatever, or like even in the environment where, I guess, like a board of directors searches inside the company for a new CEO, that they might not stand out. These other types of leaders who are just like, they're not spectacular, not terrible, totally self-assertive, but maybe they're good thinkers. They make decisions carefully. Now, in order to, like, what you're saying, there's a way to create a procedure for leader selection, which kind of gives a better chance to these people.
Correct.
And the procedure is the way I understood it is, first off, there should be clear criteria, like, and a lot of them, which should be put forward by, the constituency.
All I've given you there is an example. What's significant is there in that is not. I'm not saying this is the only way to do it. What's significant is that, and this is what is similar with the selection of a jury, which is not a merit-based selection at all, but both the selection of the jury and the selection of the spokespeople in the process I described. There's nothing you can do to campaign to get the position. The best way to get the position is to be thought well of by other people, which is a very different way to think about what you want from a leader. Now, as I said, I'm not even saying you only want those kinds of leaders. What I'm saying is that those kinds of leaders are being systematically discriminated against, and cultures need different types of people, and these are some of the most valuable types of people you can find. And if you start rewarding them, and people actually lead happier lives when they're closer to these internal goods. They're more productive and they feel better. There's a nice story. There's a nice story about the productivity of chickens, and this was a farmer or maybe it was an experiment. But what they did was they took, I don't think it was. I think it was a sort of agricultural experiment, and they were trying to get the most productive chickens. That is, the ones that grew the most or had the most eggs. And so they selectively bred. They each chicken that was in the what's the plural for chickens? You know, the group of chickens. I can't remember what it is. The brood or whatever. Each chicken.
Pool of pack of children, chickens. Whatever. I don't know.
No, I don't think so. So what they did was they would do they did the obvious thing, which is to pick the chicken that was largest and the chickens that lay the most eggs. They pulled them out of the pack and threw the rest away, and kept doing that for 10 generations. And then their productivity went down. It went down because they were picking the most aggressive chickens, and they ended up with a big chicken fight. And so you had to select for the group, not for the individual. So it's a very similar story here. In a culture, you do want super chickens, probably, and you also want all those chickens that scratch around and make it good for the other chickens and care about people and or go and notice things that need to be done that no one's going to do and that don't turn up in their KPIs but really need to be done. And these are the sorts of things that are being missed out in quite a, in I think, ways that are getting worse and worse because one generation leads to the next generation. In fact, the chicken example is a nice way to show that. It gets worse and worse and worse. And I think our culture,
with the time.
Exactly. And it becomes harder to stand against this because you just feel like a mug. No one takes you seriously, and you go off and decide to become a hippie or something. You just don't want to be part of that. And that's very unfortunate. That's very unfortunate for everyone.
Yeah, I absolutely love this metaphor. This really gives a lot of food for thought.
I think so. And if you want to be happy and you want to be productive, we've got a pretty pathological society and a pretty pathological business culture. And I'm not even talking about, businesses that pollute and all that stuff. Most of that, I mean, certainly among big multinationals and so on, they're pretty good in most respects. But are the people inside them happy? I don't think so.
Yeah, well, I guess, I'll send the link to your full essay. We'll have it sent to our audience. And I find there's a great potential in just taking time and thinking a little bit about this whole internal goods thing and how pursuing them might enhance not just personal lives of people doing the work, but also benefit their companies and the society at large.
Absolutely. No question.
Right. So I have to, at this point, thank you for being with us and for this delightful conversation. Also at this late an hour in Australia.
I know.
I have to say
it's great thanks. It's getting grim. It's 1:13 in the morning, but that's all right. My football team won, so I'm feeling okay.
Yeah, so great thanks to you for providing your time so that we could carefully prepare for this and for all the beautiful reading that you've sent me and that we're going to forward to our audience, and for this discussion. Great to have you, Nicholas.
Thank you. Well, we've got at least another hour's discussion for the next one, so maybe it'll come sometime.
Perfect.
Who knows?
I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to that, and I guess I'm not the only one. Thanks.
Thank you, Sergey. I must come to visit Russia at some stage when they let me out of the house, but they're not letting me out of the house at this stage.
I'm up for showing you around in Moscow. So.
Fantastic. I haven't been to Moscow and I haven't been to St. Petersburg, but I've just read a biography of Catherine the Great, who bought 4,000 of the best paintings in Europe in the 18th century, and I want to go and see some of them. So I'll be there.
Oh, yeah. Hermitages. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
Hermitage, exactly. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. So now I'll shortly announce our next webinar, which is going to take place on July 21st at 17 o'clock as usual. We're going to have Bree Williams, who's an expert in buying behavior, and who's going to talk about how to apply behavioral economics to customer purchasing patterns so you delete all the hesitation and maximize every dollar of your marketing spend. Bree Williams is a certified public accountant with a degree in applied psychology, and she founded People Patterns, a consultancy, in 2011. And that's a consultancy that helps businesses maximize their chances of influencing customers and stakeholders through behavioral nudges. So prior to this, she has worked in finance, HR, and product management for some of Australia's leading brands. She's a regular contributor to Smart Company and Marketing magazine, and she has written several books, including the book Behavioral Economics for Business. So make sure to tune in. We've had a few discussions with Bree in preparation for this, and she has some amazing insights and clear models on what you can do with your marketing messaging in order to shift the behavior of the consumer towards preferring certain product. So see you then. That's going to be July 21st, 17 o'clock. And thank you for being with us today. Bye.